call themselves praxeologists, and their discipline praxeology. These scholars, most of whom are academics from France and Poland, publish the series Praxeology, the International Annual of Practical Philosophy and Methodology. Mises himself kept up with the praxeologists at a distance. In 1956 he noticed with interest the existence of a journal of praxeology that was edited by a scholar at the University of Melbourne in Florida. He distinguished the two approaches in a letter to Stephen B. Miles, dated April 19, 1961. In any case, praxeology had not yet come to be as closely associated with anti-economics as had the term sociology, and Hayek reported from London that the term was unknown in English, and thus Mises eventually adopted it as a label for his general theory of human action. Work on his great treatise also progressed in other fields. One of the important areas that he had neglected for the past 2 decades was methodology. He had written on the epistemology of economic science, but he had not yet dealt with the more narrowly technical aspects of economic analysis. Mises now proceeded to this task by elaborating on the scattered methodological observations he had made in previous writings. Occasionally he made interesting observations on the methodology and the logical character of economics in his correspondence. Of particular interest is a letter to Lionel Robbins, commenting on the second edition of The Nature and Significance of Economic Science. The letter also demonstrates that Mises was in touch with the positivistic Vienna circle. He refers to correspondence with the mathematical economist Karl Menger, the son of the founder of the Austrian school. He presented his very first paper dealing with purely methodological questions in early March 1938 in Venice, at a conference held in memory of the French pioneer of mathematical economics, Augustin Cournot. The paper was eventually published in the proceedings of the conference as Les hypothèses de travail dans la science économique, Working Hypotheses in Economic Science. In previous writings he had no more than touched on methodological questions. Fittingly, Mises dealt with one of the core elements of mathematical economics, namely the concept of economic equilibrium. He argued that this concept did have an important role in economic analysis, but not nearly as important as the champions of mathematical economics made it out to be. The equilibrium construct was necessary as the logical opposite of entrepreneurial profit and loss. In equilibrium, there would be no such thing as profit or loss. Only in disequilibrium did these phenomena come into being. But where these statements only refined the basic conceptual framework that had already been elaborated by Frank Knight, Mises also emphasized that the equilibrium construct was necessary only for the correct conception of profit and loss, and for no other economic phenomena. For some time he had also advocated the use of equilibrium as a methodological device for the analysis of dynamic changes. Notice that Mises was perfectly familiar with the pioneering works on mathematical equilibrium theory that Wald, Rosenstein-Rodan, Morgenstern and others had just published in the Zeitschrift für Nationalökonomie. At about the same time, the Austrian Chamber of Commerce was completely reorganized. Mises asked to be retired by January 1st, 1938, emphasizing that he would continue to work for the new Chambers of Commerce if they sought his services. They did. In early February 1938, Wilhelm Becker, right-hand man to the new president of the Bundeskammer, asked Mises to become the chief of the Department for Monetary and Financial Affairs. The only caveat was that Mises had to give up his position in Geneva. Mises probably went to Vienna around February 20th to discuss the project. Eventually, the reforms turned the Kammer into a pure bureaucracy. One reason for his renewed interest in returning to Vienna might have been the precarious financial situation of the Institute. In the course of 1936, it had become clear that certain elements within the Rockefeller Foundation were increasingly reluctant to lend further support. Thus, in the fall of 1937, Mises seriously considered a return to Vienna. He then gave much thought to the central political problem of his fatherland, preserving the liberty of its citizens against the encroachments of the mighty neighbors north and south. Mises was convinced that this problem could only be solved within a federation of the East European language communities, nations, under a strong Danubian central state. In early 1938 he laid out a confidential master plan for the necessary reforms in a 10-page paper with the title Principles for the Creation of a New Order in the Danube area. Leitsätze für die Neuordnung der Verhältnisse im Donauraum. He left a copy at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, but also took copies with him when he left for the United States in 1940. Here he argued that such a new order would require the East European countries to overcome their protectionism, which Mises saw as the root cause of conflict among them, which was in turn the cause of their weakness confronted with their three mighty neighbors, Russia, Germany, and Italy. But to abandon protectionism requires far more than the legal abolition of customs and import quotas. It also implies abolishing the special privileges that come through monetary policy, taxation, health and safety regulations, and construction codes, public works, railway rates, and many other fields of public administration. From this, Mises draws a far-reaching conclusion. It is not sufficient to limit the sovereignty of the different governments through a customs union. Indeed, their whole administration would have to be run by a federal government. Without a central government overarching all national governments, the latter would engage in nationalistic policies against the minorities within their territory, thus creating tensions and conflicts that would ultimately explode the Confederation. In short, Mises proposed to counteract the military threat of the moment through a political federation with other smaller states of the Danube area. But such a federation could work only if national protectionism could be eliminated. It followed that the political institutions of the federation had to be radically centralized. He went into more detail. The local governments and courts must take account of minorities by using all languages spoken by more than 15% of the local population. Because economic legislation, in particular free trade, and the regulation of banking and money must be uniform in all countries, one needs a central parliament and a central jurisdiction. The proceedings of these institutions would be in an official language, and Mises believed French or English should be chosen. The central organizations would have to be located in Vienna, which would have a special status corresponding to the status of Washington, D.C. within the United States. In order to avoid jealousy among the national populations, some of the federal officers would have to be of French or British nationality. It needs to be stressed that the primary purpose of Mises' proposal was not to create closer economic cooperation in the Danube area. This could have been achieved without any political unification whatsoever, through the simple unilateral adoption of free trade by each government. The point of his scheme was to secure a maximum of political liberty under present conditions. In his eyes, Austria and the other countries of the area had the choice between abandoning a part of their autonomy to become strong enough to resist foreign pressure, or losing their autonomy altogether. Either they would become subservient provinces ruled by Germany, Russia, and Italy, or they would rule themselves in a common central state. A majority of Austrian leaders abhorred the prospect of political centralization. They sought national self-determination first and foremost. The point of Mises' paper was to show that they were in error. National independence was not a suitable means, under present circumstances, to attain the end of national self-determination. Those who rejected a supranational central government for the Danube Basin implicitly believed that England and France were going to defend them permanently, but these two countries would become tired of fighting wars on behalf of the eastern states, and would eventually demand that they create a political system that could survive on its own. With these plans in mind, Mises went to Vienna in February 1938. He later developed his plan for the establishment of an Eastern Democratic Union in much more detail in two major papers that have only recently been published. Entwurf von Richtlinien für den Wiederaufbau Österreichs, May 1940, 51 pages, and an Eastern Democratic Union, a proposal for the establishment of a durable peace in Eastern Europe, October 1941, 43 pages. He had other reasons to return to the city on the Danube, getting the paperwork done for marriage. For some 10 years, Margit had waited patiently for him to propose. 8 months after the death of his mother at Christmas 1937, Ludwig was finally ready. True to himself, he left out all ornamental talk, and went on to propose with his habitual concision. "I cannot go on further. I cannot live without you, darling. let's get married. Margit was incredulous and the happiest she'd ever been. They lost no time making plans. One of the formalities was the public announcement of their wedding plans 6 weeks before the ceremony. But world events conspired against personal happiness. During those weeks before their announced wedding date, Adolf Hitler threatened Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg. Germany would provoke civil war in Austria and invade the country. On extremely short notice, Schuschnigg announced a general referendum on Austria's unification with Germany. The vote was to take place the next Sunday, March 13th. Mises was in town on one of his short visits, probably coming in from the Cournot conference he had attended in Venice. In the course of this week it became clear that the Germans were preparing to invade Austria to prevent the referendum from ever taking place. The cautious Mises knew that he was high on the Nazi enemy list, and he left Vienna on Thursday the 10th, or early on Friday the 11th of March, not a moment too soon, as it turned out. On Friday, March 11th, 1938, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler arrived in Vienna with an advance contingent to arrest the most important adversaries of Hitler and seize their property. 2 days later, on March 13th, after the German army had reached Vienna at the end of a triumphant march through the country, a group of men broke into Mises' apartment and searched it. At the end of March, the Gestapo came and took 21 boxes full of Mises' possessions and sealed the apartment when they left. In the fall, the Gestapo returned and took the rest. They looted everything they could find. The books Mises had lovingly collected over decades, his personal correspondence, paintings, silver, personal and administrative documents, everything, even the laundry. Mises would never see these belongings again and never learn what happened to them. At the end of the Second World War, the Red Army found his personal files, together with the document of other prominent enemies of the Nazi regime, in a train in Bohemia. They were then sent to a secret archive in Moscow. In 1991, 18 years after Mises' death, they were rediscovered and are today a most precious tool for biographers of the great economist. Mises' personal library went in different directions. The Nazis sent his book collection to a new Judenbibliothek in Berlin. This library was under the control of Heinrichs Sicherheitsdienst, SD, and located at Eisenacher Straße 12. However, it is not known where Mises' books are today. During the Second World War, the collections of the Judenbibliothek were sent back and forth to the provinces to protect them against Allied bombings. They were also subject to various transfers, book exchanges with other libraries, and plunder. By 1956, Mises knew that some of his books had turned up in German second-hand bookshops, and opined that some of his letters, 2 letters he had received from Sigmund Freud, for example, would be found one day in the possession of an autograph dealer. The looting of his apartment was only the beginning. The new authorities soon discontinued his salary and pension payments and attached his bank account for an escape tax, Reichsfluchtsteuer, and a Jewish tax, Judenabgabe. 9 years later, speaking of the reluctance of the Kammer to make restitution for those payments, his former secretary wrote, "But how right you were when you prophesied that we would be cheated of everything." They also confiscated the most marketable part of Ludwig and Richard's inheritance, a widely known collection of some 150 rare gold coins, and more than 3,000 other coins and medals that their father, Arthur von Mises, had bequeathed to his sons in 1903. There's also the summary list of stolen coins that Mises composed in 1960, but apparently did not submit to the authorities. Köhler was a lawyer in Vienna. Mises got in touch with him after learning about the ratification of a US-Austrian treaty in 1955, but the deadline for claims had already expired in 1953. Most of the gold coins were Polish and pre-1892 Austrian coins. In 1962, Mises eventually obtained restitution, not from Austrian, but from German authorities, in the value of the estimated weight of the collection, some 25 troy ounces. Mises' family property had become free booty. The Nazis had prepared the takeover of Austria with diligent care. They had studied all writings that even remotely questioned the Nazi cause or any of its ideals. After the takeover, they sought the authors of these works, Perfectly harmless men such as Karl Bruckhausen, a philanthropist and pacifist of some international reputation, were interviewed by the German secret police. But the Gestapo also took on the greatest champion of National Socialism in Vienna, Ottmar Spann. The author of Der wahre Staat was all in favor of strong government, but it would have to be a government in the service of the right ideas, his ideas. Attempts to co-opt him as a Hitler propagandist quickly failed, and he and his son Raphael ended up in the Dachau concentration camp, where he was tortured and partially lost his eyesight. Mises later testified, "Not all those persecuted were anti-Nazis. For instance, Professor Ottmar Spann, one of the outstanding champions of the Nazi doctrine, spent some time in a concentration camp because he was connected with Gregor Strasser, the personal rival of Hitler." Ironically, the prison term that he served under Hitler eventually whitewashed him after the war. Spann's doctrines continued to be taught in Vienna until the late 1960s. This was not a time of people with backbone. It was the time of the Hans Meyers of the world. A few weeks after the Anschluss, Meyer wrote the members of the Nationalökonomische Gesellschaft announcing that the membership of non-Aryans had been cancelled. Meyer kept his chair at the university just as he would retain it when the Social Democrats returned to power after the Second World War. Decades afterward, Lionel Robbins recalled exactly the time when his love affair with Vienna came to an abrupt end. Namely, when to his eternal shame, Hans Meyer, the senior professor of economics in the University of Menge, Wiese and bohm-bawerk, whom I myself had more than once heard denouncing Hitler and all his works, instead of closing down, as he could honourably have done, expelled the Jewish members from the Nationalökonomische Gesellschaft, of which he was the president. I have never been able to screw myself up to go back since. This is also how Mises felt about the incident. It took him many years after the war before he could bring himself to return to his once beloved city. Many scholars had to leave Austria to make way for the Hans Meyers of the new era, and a great number of them passed through Switzerland. In the coming months and years, Mises increased his efforts to find employment for Austrian expatriates abroad. Engel Janosi could not find a job in Turkey, where only Turks were allowed to teach modern history. To Makhlouf, Mises wrote, "I'm completely clueless what to do with the masses of Viennese that turn to me for help. Nobody is allowed to stay in Switzerland." Margit later recalled, "We helped whenever we could. Our living room looked like a miniature Red Cross office. I was always writing, packing, shipping." This came at a time when his own position in Geneva became financially precarious. Together with his brother Richard, he also took care of relatives and personal friends who had not managed to flee in time. These efforts were instrumental in bringing about a rapprochement of the Mises brothers, even though it could still not be called a warm relationship. When Ludwig married Margit in July, he did not deem it necessary to mention the fact in their correspondence. Richard found out about it a month later through their Aunt Fanny, and asked Ludwig for a confirmation, yet even then it was not Ludwig who replied, but Margit. Through her warmth and charm, she eventually eased the relationship between the recalcitrant brothers when they were later in some proximity on the western shores of the Atlantic. Margit and her daughter Gitta had remained in Vienna for several weeks after the Anschluss because they did not have the necessary paperwork to leave the country. At this time, their lives would have been in greater danger if their relationship with Mises had been known. Eventually, they were able to leave, and Ludwig greeted them at the train station in Zurich, flowers in hand. She later recalled, "In the 13 years we shared before our marriage, I had never seen Lou cry. Nor did I ever see him cry in all the 35 years of our married life. He wept, unrestrained and unabashed. Tears were streaming down his face, and he was not ashamed of them." On July 6th, 1938, they were married in Geneva. The original marriage certificate is in the files of the Graduate Institute of International Studies. Margit's records: Hungarian nationality, born on July 3rd, 1890. Father's name was Albert Herzfeld. Mother's name was Selika Fontheim. It was a simple administrative ceremony before a civil judge and 2 witnesses, Hans Kelsen and Gottfried von Habeler. Ludwig and Margit spent their honeymoon in the French Alps. It was a grand opening to a happy period of their lives. Ludwig now worked quickly and productively on the completion of his magnum opus, and he had the time and money to live a joyful life in the company of Margit. Her children were at boarding schools and stayed with them only during vacations. His years with Margit brought about a profound positive transformation of Mises's personality. He was still obstinate in his opinions and formal in his demeanor, but in interaction with other people he became much less buttoned down. Most importantly, his temper improved. The outbursts and tantrums that Margit had so dreaded disappeared completely after a few years. He greatly needed her love, and he got it. Even though she herself had a great ego, she adapted her life to make him happy. Arriving in Geneva, she had to start at square one. Mises's good friend, Weiss Wellenstein, had warned her that her life with Ludwig would not be easy, and indeed it was quite difficult at first. Mises introduced her to his closest associate only after the marriage, and not without warning. Here in Geneva, when men talk, women have to be silent. They only listen. Even Kelsen and Habeler, who were after all their witnesses, she met only shortly before the wedding, and only afterward did Margit move into Ludwig's apartment. There she found, to no surprise, a bachelor's residence. The furniture was first class and beautifully kept, but the whole apartment looked to me like a display in a department store. It was cold and impersonal. She went on, "For the first time I saw a refrigerator. We did not have them yet in Vienna, and it was a real marvel to me. I loved Lou's sparkling kitchen, but otherwise I had my doubts. The apartment was small. I would not have known where to put my belongings." But right from the first day, the transformation of his personality set in. Mises had changed his attitude. Margit was no longer just a friend and lover. She was now Mrs. von Mises, the comrade he had longed for, and the object of his true and deep love. So complete and radical was this change that he would henceforth refuse to even talk about the 13 years before the wedding. It was as if he had put the past in a trunk, stored it in the attic, and thrown away the key. For Margit, this total break with the past would always be a burden, but the benefits were obvious. From the day of our marriage, Lou was a changed person. Not that he spoiled me with gifts or presents, he would not have known how to do that, but he was relaxed, affectionate, and his eyes were sparkling with happiness. Every little thing I did was of interest to him. The world had changed for him. Lou was overpowering in his love and affection for me. Never was he cross or dissatisfied with anything I did. He could not nag. There was not one day, to the very end of his life, that he did not tell me, "I love you, darling. Oh, how I love you." It seemed to me after our marriage that for the first time in his life he felt really fulfilled and happy. The events in Austria had brought a number of their former Vienna friends to Geneva, and it was almost like the old days. Lunches and dinners with Helene Liese, Louis Sommer, Lise Berger, Hans Kelsen, and the Nierensteins. Mises also visited frequently with the local Guggenheims and Ginsbergs. They went out almost every weekend for a drive across the French border, and with the help of the Michelin guide, they explored the delights of French cuisine and the beauties of the alpine landscape on both sides of the border. Margit bravely assisted her new husband on the road. He definitely had an adventurous side, and enjoyed the thrills of high speed and the centrifugal pull of mountain curves. On one of these curves he lost control of the car, which suddenly lurched over the roadside barrier into the valley's abyss. Margit and Ludwig held their breath, but the car did not move. Then he pulled back slowly, and they continued the rest of the way in a more civilized composure. They were both thoroughly fond of driving, but they were terrible drivers. They had at least 2 other serious accidents in 1948 and 1966. They had other scary moments for completely different reasons. One day, a dark car stopped them on one of their excursions, and a man in a long dark coat told Mises he had to talk to him. He asked Mises to follow him into the other car, which of course Mises refused to do. There were veiled threats, but the situation was resolved when a friend who was a high official of the League of Nations presented himself to the strangers, who hurried back to their car and left. Mises and family had the distinct impression that they had just avoided an attempted kidnapping. Such events made them think about leaving Europe entirely and emigrating to the United States. They considered this option seriously in the fall of 1938. Richard von Mises refers to such statements from Margit in a letter to Ludwig dated December 29, 1938. At this point, Mises' treatise on Nationalökonomie was already very close to completion, said Mises to Machlup in a letter dated December 18, 1938. Personal danger in Switzerland was not the only factor involved. Mises knew that his school was in financial difficulties and that it was possible his contract would not be extended. The Walter Lippmann Colloquium. 7 weeks after his wedding, Ludwig attended a historic meeting of the champions of both old Manchester-style liberalism and of neoliberalism. His new bride probably forgave him and may even have joined him on the trip. The conference took place in Paris. Neoliberalism was at first a purely informal phenomenon. Virtually all of its proponents were economists who cooperated in a spontaneous network within a few institutions, such as the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris. By the mid-1930s, the network had reached the critical mass needed for a more formal organization under the banner of the New Third Way. One important step toward the organized appearance of the emerging neoliberal network was made when, in 1937, the American journalist Walter Lippmann published a neoliberal manifesto with the title Inquiry into the Principles of the Good Society. The book appealed to European neoliberals because Lippmann gave eloquent expression to their own deeply held views about the roots of the present political and economic crisis. Those who still called themselves liberals rejected socialism, but did not want to be too strongly associated with the Manchester doctrine of laissez-faire. Lippmann placed himself in opposition of both the old liberals and to the contemporaneous socialist agitators. Lippmann's middle-of-the-road position suited the pragmatic mentality of his countrymen. Americans tended to take a business-like approach to political conflicts, seeking to solve them through negotiation and compromise. Lippmann shrewdly presented both the Socialist and the Manchester men as stubborn doctrinaires. He contrasted these extremists with his own practical-minded scheme. This resonated with the neoliberal continental European economists of the interwar period, who differed from Lippmann only in the details they envisioned for the good society. One of these was Louis Rouget, 1889-1982, a philosopher at the University of Paris and director of Centre Danubien. Rouget considered Lippmann's book a brilliant exposition of a consensus that had emerged among liberal scholars in the recent past, most notably in books by Mises, Robbins, Laverne, Marliot, and Ruff. He quickly arranged for a French edition of The Good Society and seized the occasion to convene a 5-day colloquium in Paris, with the idea of reviewing the process of capitalism and of trying to define the doctrine, the conditions necessary for its implementation, and the new responsibilities of a true liberalism. He later emphasized that the purpose was to define neoliberalism. The event took place on August 26th through the 30th, 1938, at the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation, and it assembled representatives of very different liberalisms. These men fell into at least 4 groups, with distinctly different views on the history, theory, and political agenda of modern liberalism. The first group, which represented the mainstream of neoliberalism, promoted not only practical but also theoretical compromise with coercive socialism. They were willing to compromise on any particular item to make their general agenda more palatable to the voter. Their position can be thought of as pro-market social democracy. Second, there was a small group of men such as Hayek who were dissatisfied with various aspects of classical liberalism and endorsed a somewhat larger scope for government intervention. In contrast to the first group, however, their fundamental concern was with individual freedom, and in time they therefore took an increasingly radical stance, moving ever closer to the classical liberal position. Third, there was an equally small group of men such as Alexander Rustov, who were reluctant to endorse classical liberalism root and branch, but their main objection was to the egalitarianism, such as it was, of its advocates. They argued that hierarchy was absolutely necessary for the maintenance of a free society, because only the authority implied in it would effectively transmit the cultural tradition of liberty. The great error of the French Revolution was that it had not only abolished the coercive hierarchy of Ancien Régime, but it also jettisoned the principle of hierarchy per se. In its egalitarian favor, it had tossed out the natural hierarchy baby with the coercive hierarchy bathwater. Fourth and finally, Ludwig von Mises upheld 19th-century laissez-faire policies on refined theoretical grounds that he himself had developed over the past 18 years. By the 1930s, he was acknowledged both within and outside libertarian circles as the most important contemporary representative of the Manchester School. The anonymous reviewer of the French edition of Gemeinwirtschaft presented the author as the uncontested head of the school of Austrian economists. When Louis Baudin invited Mises to join the scientific committee of a new French journal of comparative economics in 1939, he told him that all political orientations would be represented in this committee. Reason enough to have liberalism defended by masters such as Mises. The uniqueness of Mises' role was still recognized some 20 years later by one of the last surviving students of the French laissez-faire school. Writing to Mises in September 1957, the Professor A. Bastet said that Mises was the successor to our master, Yves Guillot, who himself was the successor to Gustave de Molinari, 1819-1912, and Molinari was successor to the great Proto-Austrian Frédéric Bastiat, 1801-1850. The Lippmann colloquium showed that three of Mises' insights had had a profound impact on the neoliberals. First, his demonstration that socialist calculation was impossible had liberated them from all notions that a full-blown socialist commonwealth was feasible or even desirable on economic grounds. Second, the socialist calculation argument had convinced them that competitive pricing is of utmost importance and a defining characteristic of the free market. Third, they endorsed Mises' original case for liberalism, which stressed that a private property order was the only feasible system for the division of labor. The latter two insights, however, came to be twisted so as to fit the neoliberal interventionist agenda. Whereas Mises had simply stated that a calculation-based division of labor could take place only where private property exists, the neoliberals set out to manipulate the legal and judicial systems in order to improve on the spontaneous division of labor that would have resulted from political laissez-faire. For these men, the market was critically important, but they believed that government intervention could enhance the efficiency and fairness of the market process. Unlike socialists, neoliberals believed that the market took society in the right direction, but unlike classical liberals, they believed that the unhampered market fell short of its true potential. In a preface to the first German edition of The Good Society, 1945, Wilhelm Röpke emphasized the orientation of neoliberal policies toward the optimization of the social machine. Thus, the question is not for or against laissez-faire, rather it is which judicial order, Rechtsordnung, fits an economic constitution that is just, free, of the highest productivity and based on a sophisticated division of labor. As this preface shows, Röpke was deeply impressed by Lippmann's work, which he believed had had a tremendous impact on the neoliberal movement. As a consequence of this particular interpretation of Mises' theory of social systems, the neoliberals also reinterpreted the significance of Mises' insights about the importance of competitive pricing. Mises had argued that a rational division of labor could be based only on market prices for factors of production, which in turn required private ownership of these factors. In contrast, the neoliberals focused exclusively on the prices themselves, neglecting the conditions under which free pricing occurs. For them, the practical conclusion of the socialist calculation argument was not that government should not interfere with property in general, but rather that it should be kept from meddling with prices specifically. At the colloquium, Lippmann was praised for his distinction between market-compatible interventions and interventions incompatible with the operation of a market economy. Rüstow prided himself on having coined the phrase liberaler Interventionismus, classical liberal interventionism. As early as 1932, he probably referred to his talk at the 1932 Dresden meeting of the Verein. Only direct interference with the working of the price mechanism was illegitimate. If the government limited itself to controlling only the legal framework within which the market participants would be left free to pursue their projects as they wished, then this intervention would be unobjectionable from a neoliberal point of view. The unifying principle of post-war neoliberal theories was an attempt to justify liberty in some cases and state-sponsored violence in others, through one and the same theory. The most important products of these endeavors with a theory of public goods and the Chicago Cohesion theory of law and economics. Mises relentlessly criticized a neoliberal interpretation of the significance of the socialist calculation argument. From his point of view, the arbitrary distinction between the play of the price mechanism and the framework of the market was nonsensical. The nature of government intervention is to violate private property rights, thereby affecting the price mechanism in all cases. While it is true that certain phenomena result only from direct interference with the pricing process, shortages and surpluses most notably, the larger issue of economic calculation remains. It is ultimately irrelevant whether government intervention meddles directly with prices or indirectly through the framework of price formation. In either case, market prices are perverted. Plans for after the war. Parallel to the work on his Treatise of Economics, or Praxeology as he now called it, Mises spent much time writing and teaching about concrete contemporary political problems. In my course at Geneva dealing with the economic and sociological doctrines in modern political thought, I used to devote many hours to a full refutation of the Nazi doctrines. He applied the general theory of praxeology to explain the rise of Nazism, and he probably also presented his plans for the time after Hitler. He also wrote down these thoughts in a book, manuscript, and in several lengthy memoranda. By 1938 he had already composed a book manuscript that described The Way of the German People toward National Socialism, the working title in June 1940, when he left a copy of the manuscript with his colleague Potter. The work would eventually be published in an English translation in 1944 under the title Omnipotent Government. Here Mises elaborates on the thesis developed in his 1919 book Nation, State and Economy, in which he had explained the rise of German imperialism. He now stressed that the age of nationalist protectionism had created an incentive for war. Protectionism promoted the interests of some citizens at the expense of all other citizens, subject to the government that applied protectionist measures. But it also came at the expense of foreigners, who therefore stood to gain from a violent overthrow of that government. Mises would later make this point in a paper delivered to an American audience. The reasoning of the old liberals can be condensed in one sentence. War is useless in a liberal world. This theorem is absolutely correct, but we must not forget the condition in a liberal world. Our world is very different, and in this world you cannot say that war is useless. It is not true that the individual citizen cannot derive any advantage of a victorious war. In the world of state interventionism, the territorial expansion of his own state is of the utmost importance to each individual citizen. Every benefit which he derives from his own government is the more valuable the larger its territory is. Every new conquest further restricts the area in which discrimination is applied against him. When the Second World War broke out in September 1939, Mises was already thinking about the time after the war, a war that Mises was absolutely convinced Hitler would lose. When the war eventually reached the Western theatre in May 1940, Mises had reached the conclusion that the major economic problem of the post-war period would be shortage of capital. To attract foreign capital and to stimulate the capital accumulation, governments would be forced to accept far-reaching curtailments of their sovereignty. These states will have to renounce any powers in the field of money, credit, trade and taxation on behalf of foreign capital. They will have to submit themselves unconditionally to the jurisdiction of international courts and accept that the decisions of these courts be imposed by an international police force. This might sound somewhat strange, Mises concedes, but a state is free to choose whether it accepts these conditions for receiving foreign capital, and there is a strong political rationale for the abandonment of national sovereignty. Small states must have an effective protection against aggression by bigger states. States engaging in secret rearmament must be prevented from the execution of their plans by an international police. Governments that violate peace must be treated as robbers and murderers are treated within each state. By May 1940, Mises had elaborated a fairly detailed plan for Austria's post-war reconstruction. This plan is of some interest because, 1. It is representative of the applied work he did, for example, in the context of his Kammer activities, and 2. Shows the relatively large scope Mises allowed for government activity within the framework of a market economy. The starting point for his considerations was that Austria could feed its population of 6.5 million people only as an industrialized nation, which requires entrepreneurs who know how to produce for the world market. In old Austria, there had been about 1,000 such men. Today these entrepreneurs were gone, because the government, the trade unions, and the whole country had fought a war against them. At least 2/3 of them were Jews. Their firms were Aryanized, according to the Marxist idea that the workers and the means of production are all that matter in a firm. The entrepreneurs are mere exploiters. However, without the spirit and the energy of the entrepreneur, a firm is just a heap of junk and scrap. And even those entrepreneurs who were not murdered and tortured could not continue their business because of foreign exchange controls and central planning. As a consequence, Austria would face a far more difficult situation than it faced after the First World War, when the creative and industrious entrepreneurs saved the country despite the obstructions thrown up by the government. This time, Austria would not be able to count on post-war imports of foreign capital. Mises' positive program for the post-war period contained several standard classical liberal positions: that the currency must be based on gold, that the central bank must be obliged to redeem its notes and to demand deposits against gold at the legal rate, no foreign exchange controls would be permissible, and Austria would have to follow a strict free trade policy. Then, however, Mises proceeded to an astounding contention. Free trade does not mean that all import duties are abolished. It only means that one does not try to increase domestic prices through import duties in order to enable domestic producers to sell their products at higher prices than their foreign competitors. Thus, two kinds of import duties are in accordance with free trade. A. Financial duties, which have to correspond to domestic sales taxes, and B. Retortion duties on the import of all or certain commodities from countries pursuing a policy which is hostile to the interests of Austrian trade. Entwurf von Richtlinien für den Wiederaufbau Österreichs. But Mises also recommended several measures of government intervention. He said that Austria should never impose import duties on luxury goods, which implies that such duties could be taken on other goods, because a major part of its own export is composed of such goods. Interdictions of imports for public health and veterinary reasons were legitimate, and weapons imports must be reserved for the government. Interdictions of export should be allowed only from military considerations in times of political tension. Similarly, restrictions of business activity are permissible in the production and trade of weapons, drugs, and poisons. Mises championed a program of thorough political centralization. On behalf of taxation, he claimed, all taxes and duties accrue directly to the state. The communal authorities have no power of taxation. They get their means from the state. He spelled out a definite list of taxes. A. Sales taxes for alcohol and tobacco. B. A sales tax that is only levied on commodities bought by consumers. C. An income tax on wages to finance the social security system. D. A progressive tax on housing expenditures. E. A tax on luxury cars. F. A tax on lottery gains. G. A tax on playing cards. H. Fees for certain administrative acts, registering of patent rights, brands, etc. I. A moderate taxation of yields of more than 6% on capital which are paid out to the stock owners of corporations with limited liability. Mises emphasized that, apart from point C, there could be no income taxes. Penalizing income kills the goose that lays the golden eggs. Moreover, all public enterprises would have to be sold or closed if their proceeds did not cover costs. In order to avoid expensive double administration, the state alone should direct the whole administration of the county. The only other level under the central institutions of the state was that of the county administrations and courts. The communal authorities would have to execute the tasks set for them by the general legislation. Their only revenue would come from the state and from public firms and property. The purpose of this ultra-centralized structure was to avoid corruption and waste of public money. The postal, telegram, and telephone services would be organized by a single post office in Vienna. Employment in the public administration was to be regulated according to the French competitive system to prevent protectionism, nepotism, and corruption. Mises goes on to discuss how to deal with the Austrian government officials who served under the Nazis. Whether they may stay in the public services is to be decided case by case in the interest of the state. The system of education has to be radically restructured. The Volksschule, elementary school, needed to be nationalized, and all institutions of higher education had to fall under the direct responsibility of the Department of Education. Mises even made proposals on the specific content of education. In the Gymnasien, pupils should be obliged to learn English and French, and the requirements to pass exams should be considerably increased because only extraordinarily talented and industrial pupils merit that the state incurs special expenses for their education. Mises's pronouncements on the Austrian universities were severe. While their expenses constantly increased, the scientific level decreased ever further. The University of Vienna would therefore have to be established anew, with the help of Western European scholars and of Austrian professors teaching abroad. The universities of Graz and Innsbruck would have to be closed altogether, since they had long since lost the right to call themselves universities. In order to reduce the post-war scarcity of capital, Mises suggested publicizing the new Austria's free trade policies to foreign capitalists and entrepreneurs, and attracting old Austrian entrepreneurs back to their home country. He also recommended a study of the methods of the French cultural propaganda to improve Austria's image in the world, by reference to the great cultural achievements of its sons. The selection of Austria's representatives would therefore have to be more careful. To the Western capitals, Austria should only send men who, because of their scientific importance, or because of other outstanding qualities, command a great personal reputation, and thereby can purvey Austria's representation with the prestige that it would lack otherwise. Here too France may serve as an example. Mises never put these proposals into print under his name. He always kept a strict separation between his scientific work, for which he would stand unreservedly, and his work as an economic and political consultant. His plan for Austria's post-war reconstruction fell into the latter category. One historian of his Kammer activities pointed out, at the university and in his books he showed himself as an uncompromising champion of the free market. As a practitioner and Kammer politician, he was rather flexible and ready for compromise if nothing essential had to be given up. But even in compromise, he then remained hard, and would not deviate from the course of action that had been recognized and agreed upon. It applied his scientific insights about suitable and unsuitable policies to Austria's concrete historical situation on the eve of the Second World War. It took into account the political forces at work, as well as the political orientation of the men for whom he wrote his report. Escape from Europe. The summer of 1939 was exceptionally beautiful. Ludwig and Margit spent a vacation in Les-Bains, which had a magnificently alpine setting, almost as Bad Gastein, their regular vacation spot in Austria. On August 7th, 1939, Mises wrote from Les-Bains to a Giovanni de Maria. He granted permission for an Italian translation of his Theorie des Geldes und der Umlaufsmittel, stating that he alone had all rights for translations into foreign languages. This translation probably never came into existence, but the incident showed that Italian fascism was far more tolerant than German Nazism. Mises compared Russian freedom and fascist freedom in Anti-Capitalistic Mentality. Richard von Mises paid them a visit on his way to the United States. In June, he had come to the conclusion that Turkey was no longer safe, and decided to accept a visiting position at Harvard University. They probably met on August 8th. He would soon learn how good his timing was. The war broke out on September 1st, 1939, when Mises must have been in the process of reviewing the proof pages of his Nationalökonomie. Strangely enough, during the first 8 months of the war, everything was quiet on the Western Front. The governments of France and Britain had declared war on Germany in fulfillment of the guarantees they had extended to Poland. But they did nothing to prevent the Wehrmacht from completing its invasion of Poland within 2 weeks, and they did not even declare war on the Soviet Union, which also invaded Poland in visible execution of a secret agreement between Hitler and Stalin to divide Poland between them. Thus, continuing the tradition of Frederick II and Catherine II. The simple fact was that France and Britain were utterly unprepared for a new war, militarily, economically, and mentally. There was widespread sentiment, especially in France, that the cause was not worth another round of mass slaughter. They believed that the First World War had been fought in vain, and the Treaty of Versailles had humiliated the Germans without creating justice. It had given protection to former ethnic minorities through the creation of the Czechoslovak and Polish states, but the Germans who remained there were now exposed to an oppression that was virtually indistinguishable from the one that the Czechs, Slovaks, and Poles had experienced in pre-1914 Germany and Austria. Under Hitler, the Germans set out finally to protect their co-nationals in the East, and a great number of Western Europeans found this foreign policy unobjectionable. This attitude did not express passivity or apathy. It resulted naturally from the political dogma that ruled the West in those days, namely, that ethnic self-determination was the highest political principle. But while most citizens of the West did not feel the Wehrmacht threatened their existence, the governments were ready to draw a line in the sand. In September 1939, the resolution to stop Hitler was not much more than a moral resolve. A resolve, moreover, that was half-baked and corrupted by several years of anti-fascist lobbying by the Bolshevists in Geneva. But it marked the beginning of the efforts that would eventually lead to the German defeat in the Second World War. Mises was silent on the subject, but Margit became nervous. In anticipation of a German invasion, she asked him to consider emigration to America or elsewhere. Reluctantly, Mises began to explore the possibility in correspondence with his brother Richard and Fritz Machlup, both of whom had already crossed the Atlantic. Machlup had discussed the idea of a California vacation for Mises with Benjamin Anderson and other friends from the University of California. Anderson had just moved to the Los Angeles campus of the University of California and was the most influential man in the hitherto unprestigious Department of Economics. UCLA showed interest, and the chairman of the department wrote 2 letters to Machlup, who then mediated between the two parties. In this process, things got mixed up. At first, Mises declined, when Machlup told him UCLA could offer only a comparatively low salary. Machlup's guess was that UCLA could pay at most $4,000 per annum. Mises said that his means were very limited, and that his family-related expenditures were so big that he knew not how to arrange things with the prospective salary from UCLA. Mises asked his friend to tell Dudley Pegram, the chair of the department, that his Austrian passport had expired, and that he could therefore not accept the offer at the moment, and would be grateful if the invitation could be postponed a year. While Mises's letter was on its way, Machlup wrote again, this time pointing out that an invitation from UCLA would procure you a permanent, non-quota immigration visa for the United States, which might be considered an asset these days. This convinced Mises. Meanwhile, he had received a cable from his friend Unger, a former Geneva student of his, who was already in New York City, and who told him in telegraphic language that he, Mises, was making a mistake. As soon as he received Machlup's letter on February 28th, Mises wrote back that his concerns about passport and visa questions had been dispelled, and that he would be ready to go to California. If he had cabled this message to Machlup, Mises might have begun a career in California in August 1940, and history would have been different. But Mises sent the letter by surface mail, and it reached Machlup only after he had already declined the offer on Mises's behalf. When Machlup wrote to Anderson, trying as diplomatically as I could to reopen the negotiations, he received a response from Anderson's secretary that her boss was on a short vacation. 1 month later, Pegram gave him a definitive no. Meanwhile, Mises himself had been in touch with Anderson, though on less vital matters. In March 1940, Nationalökonomie was at the printer, and there was no sign that the war would soon reach Western Europe. The printing of Nationalökonomie had started by January 1940. Mises half-jokingly surmised that it might be the last economics book published in the German language. To most citizens of the West, it was not clear that it ever would. Writing Mises from his new position in Los Angeles, Benjamin Anderson announced his intention to come to Europe in the summer. He hesitated to do so, though not from fear of danger. I have a feeling that coming to Europe at this time, even to the neutral states, is almost like going to a friend's house, when a member of the family is undergoing an operation, and that I might simply be an additional burden on busy and wary men who have more important things to do than to carry on discussions with a foreign economist. In his response, Mises assured his American friend that these fears were groundless. Your doubts about a visit in Europe are unfounded. It is just the right time for you to come and to see what is going on. Mises had been convinced that the new war would start just as the last war had ended, in the trenches. He was convinced that France and its allies would withstand any German attack, modern conditions, and made defense the most effective military strategy. But the times of battles of the old style, which permitted getting around the opponent's flank, was past on the great European theatres of war, since the massiveness of the armies and the tactics that had been reshaped by modern weapons and means of communication offered the possibility of arranging the armies in such a way that a flank attack was no longer possible. Flanks that rest on the sea or on neutral territory cannot be gotten around. Only frontal attack still remains, but it fails against an equally well-armed opponent. With these comforting thoughts in his mind, Mises had the pleasure of holding in his hands the freshly bound Nationalökonomie, the work of a lifetime. The joy lasted only for a few days before it was overwhelmed by unexpected and devastating news. In May 1940, the Wehrmacht ended the phony war and overran Western Europe in a series of blitzkrieg attacks. Mises was completely taken by surprise. He had not realized that conditions had once again changed profoundly. Tank divisions had become sufficiently fast to attack the flanks of even very large armies, especially when the divisions operated under air support. A few military theoreticians had perceived this threat during the interwar period, but it was only in the spring of 1940 that General Heinz Guderian and his men proved the threat a reality. In their purely tactical use of the Air Force in direct confrontations with enemy troops, the Germans applied the theory of the chief engineer of the French Navy, Rougeron, who at the beginning of the 1930s had synthesized the experiences of the First World War. In distinct contrast, the Western Allies would eventually apply the theories of the Italian General Giulio Douhet, according to which the Air Force should bomb the cities and supply lines in the hinterland of the enemy, thus destroying his economy and the morale of the population. Douhet's theory had already been anticipated in the strategic planning offices of the British Royal Air Force directly after its creation in the spring of 1918. The end of the war prevented the application of the plans at this point. Mises could hardly believe what he read in the newspapers. "Belgium! Holland!" he exclaimed in his notebook on May 10th. Less than 2 weeks later, Guderian reached the Channel and cut off the Allied supply lines. The British escaped at Dunkirk, and now the Germans took on the 80-some remaining French divisions one by one. On June 3rd, 1940, Louis Boudin wrote to Mises that Paris was calm. "I was not surprised by our early failures. We needed to get rid of our bad leaders and to correct people's mindsets. The Popular Front has cost us dearly." On June 14th, Mises exclaimed again, "Paris!" and 3 days later, "Armistice!" It was an ordeal. May 1940 was, as he later recalled, the most disastrous month of Europe's history. It was the only time he was ever wrong in forecasting an important political or economic event. After the Allied debacle at Dunkirk, Mises knew it was a question of days or weeks before it would be impossible to leave Geneva. His residence in Geneva would soon be unsafe. He had to act. He was high on the German government's list of wanted men. The Germans had already tried to kidnap him, and had almost succeeded. They had already been pressuring the Swiss authorities to surrender Mises. The Swiss had refused, but they had also let Mises know they had acted out of charity, and that his visa was still subject to extension on a yearly basis. The situation was already dangerous and insulting when the Germans were still on the other side of the Alps, but now The Axis troops were about to encircle Switzerland from all sides, and Mises felt his days in Geneva were numbered. Hans Kelsen and Wilhelm Röpke were in the same situation. At least for some time, Rapin and Montou planned to provide all three of them with jobs in Vichy, France. But neither of them believed this was sufficient protection, and during the next days and weeks they actively sought admission to the United States, which they received within 2 weeks of the capitulation of Paris. Holding their invitation letters for the United States in his hands, Mises and Röpke weighed again the pros and cons of another emigration. Eventually Mises and Kelsen left, while Wilhelm Röpke remained in Switzerland. Röpke too was high on the Nazi list of wanted men, and was thus at the mercy of the Swiss authorities, but he was courageous, and trusted that the influence of his friends would keep him in the country. He believed that sooner or later the West would win this war against Germany, as it had won the last one. Surrounded by fascist regimes, Switzerland naturally adapted to the new political landscape as part of a strategy of conflict minimization. In September 1940, for example, Switzerland temporarily introduced Nazi designations for its political offices and institutions, creating Gauleiter and an Arbeitsfront organization. However, the émigrés who had stayed on in the small mountain country could never be sure they would not be surrendered to the governments they had escaped. Röpke too seems to have considered emigration to the United States. This was apparently the prevailing opinion in their circle. Hayek wrote to Mises, "I agree with all you say about the prospects. I have no doubt that we shall have a dreadful time, but that in the end we shall win. But the old Europe we shall never see again. It does not seem unlikely that at some future date we shall all rejoin on the other side of the ocean. I have no intention of running away while the war lasts. But after it, I may find that if I want to continue my work at all, I may have to follow you." In retrospect, one might think that Röpke's decision was the correct one. Mises could have remained in Geneva, where he had spent some of the happiest years of his life, and enjoyed ideal conditions for his scholarly work. For him personally, the US move was a disaster, but what would the world of ideas and the world at large look like today had Mises remained in Europe? He might never have written in English. Human action would not have seen the light of day, and thus would not have reached the group of brilliant students whom Mises inspired in the New York of the 1950s and 60s, those students who carry on his ideas to this day. Mises now accepted an invitation to Berkeley that Machlup arranged to be sent to him by radiogram on May 16th. A month later, Professor Penrose from the University of California wrote another official letter of support, which was ostensibly addressed to Professor Pittman B. Potter of the Geneva Research Center, urging him to facilitate Mises's passage to the United States. The letter predicted negative consequences on American public opinion for any country that would hinder Mises's safe passage. He quickly proceeded to get his paperwork done. Visa, transatlantic fare from Lisbon to New York, etc. This took a few weeks, however, which proved to be too long. Kelsen had departed on May 28th, with the last plane leaving Switzerland from Locarno to Barcelona. When Ludwig and Margit were ready to go, Italy had entered the war on the German side, attacking France on its southeastern flank. Although the Italian onslaught was unsuccessful, it still made air travel out of Switzerland impossible. The German and Italian armies were about to close the circle around Switzerland. Already they controlled air traffic and would not allow unauthorized planes to leave the country. There was just one escape route left, by bus, but it would take them until July 3rd to obtain passage. Hayek had urged Mises to get in touch with Rouget for the French transit visa. He has worked miracles in other cases. To avoid any loss of time, I am cabling him at the same time, and you may possibly hear from him. On the afternoon of that day, a Wednesday, they were told they could leave with the American Express motor car on the following morning at 6 o'clock. Although the suitcases had been packed for many days, there was no more time for last visits with Montou and Rapin. Mises wrote a goodbye letter and left. He had already written a goodbye letter to Montou and Rapin on June 10th. He had also left a gift, possibly on this occasion, for the library, a copy of George F. Knapp, Staatliche Theorie des Geldes, second edition with Karl Menger's annotations. The Germans had not yet occupied the entire French territory between the Swiss and the Spanish border, but their troops were already setting up control posts at strategically important intersections. The bus driver, therefore, had to drive through the German lines, avoiding any direct contact with them. Fortunately, he was experienced and cautious, and he could rely on the help of the local population. Again and again he stopped to talk to people who would alert him to the presence of German troops in his path. Then he would leave the highway and take a detour on some of the more obscure lanes, often driving miles out of the way. From their windows, the passengers saw women standing in line for bread. They learned that butter was unavailable and that meat had become very scarce. The bus of predominantly Jewish refugees moved slowly but steadily through several southeastern provinces of France. Every stop must have made them anxious. Each bit of news about German troops ahead fueled their fear. Each of the many detours ate away at their nerves. Margit got upset about the couple sitting in front of them, young Charles Kinderberger and his pregnant wife, because they insisted on keeping the window open. Nerves. The ride must have seemed endless, but eventually, at the end of the day, they reached the Spanish border at Cerbère. Here they learned at the inspection house of the Spanish authorities that the border had already been closed for a week. A diplomatic solution had been found only for American and English citizens who were allowed to enter Spain and continue their trip. On the next day, the Swiss citizens were granted entry for similar diplomatic reasons, which meant, in practice, that the Portuguese and the Jewish passengers of German and Austrian origin were left stuck at the border. They stayed the night in hotels on the French side where Ludwig and Margit found cheap accommodation. The Spanish officers had advised them to talk to the Spanish consul in the nearby city of Perpignan. The consul found their papers in good order and wrote a letter of recommendation to the border officers, but to no avail. The officers now insisted they needed a special order from Madrid, and also claimed, falsely it turned out, that the passengers' Portuguese visas were no longer valid. It was Saturday. 2 days wasted. How far were the Nazi troops from Cerbère? Mises had to act, and did the only thing he could do on a Saturday afternoon, send cables soliciting the help of William Rapin and Louis Rouget. Rapin reacted immediately, and cabled on the same day to Professor Amzalak in Lisbon. Rouget had joined the new French government of Marshal Pétain. The hour of glory for the octogenarian Marshal Pétain had been the First World War, which had turned him into one of France's greatest heroes. Now he had agreed to lead his country in its darkest hour because those who had steered France into the current debacle had abandoned their positions and fled the country in panic. He could rely only on a handful of men, one of whom was Rouget, whom he used as a foreign liaison officer with his British ally, and possibly also with Spain. Rouget therefore had the necessary personal connections to plead on behalf of Mises and the other stranded bus passengers. Somehow Mises managed to get in touch with his office and was told to get new visas at the Spanish consulate in Perpignan. Meanwhile, Rapin had taken care of the Portuguese visa problem. On Monday, July 8th, Mises travelled by train to Toulouse, alone, taking the passports of all the remaining bus passengers with him. From Toulouse, where he received the new Portuguese visas, he went to Perpignan to obtain the new Spanish stamps. It was late at night when he returned to the border town where the other passengers had been waiting for him with anxiety. He had visas for everybody except the Portuguese. The next morning the bus drove again to the border control station, and this time it was allowed to pass. After 6 days of paralysis in a very difficult situation that seemed to be without issue, as Mises later wrote, the passengers received a new lease on their lives. It took them a few hours to reach Barcelona, where they reserved places on the next available plane to Lisbon. Upon their arrival in Portugal, Mises lost no time getting in touch with his travel agent. The ship for which they had made reservations had already departed. The next ship, for which bookings were still available, left in 3 weeks. Mises arranged 2 places on the waiting list, Renting a room in the Park Hotel, they lived out of a single suitcase and would not unpack any of the others so as to be ready for immediate departure. As it turned out, they only spent a few days in Lisbon. Margit was amazed to see that her husband seemed to have friends and colleagues everywhere. The city was full of foreigners waiting for passage to America. They visited with a couple of academics and former colleagues from the International Chamber of Commerce. She herself was mainly concerned about the fate of her daughter Gita. Hayek made inquiries, but could not get in touch with the director of her school in France. The morning of Thursday, July 25th, 1940, Margit received a call from the travel agent. There was a cabin available on a ship leaving in a few hours. They had to move fast. That same day, Ludwig and Margit von Mises left Europe on a ship called the Europe. It would take almost 8 years for Mises to again set foot east of the Atlantic. By then, he would be an American citizen, on his way to rebuilding the Austrian School of Economics in the United States.